There's a good reason the Space Invaders alien is a symbol representing video games in their entirety. Immediately recognizable, yet also foundationally important to the industry we see today. Shooting surely must be the most important genre, full stop, to Japanese game development. After all, it was the birthplace for many of the biggest companies still active today. You might know Capcom for Resident Evil or Street Fighter, but who's been here since their first game, Vulgus? Go back even further, you'll find one of Konami's earliest games was a clone of Space Invaders, and now they make Metal Gear Solid and Castlevania. Other notable companies played huge roles in the shooting subgenres. In consecutive years, Namco sandwiched Pac-Man with Galaxian and Galaga, then they followed up with Xevious the very next year. Nintendo clearly decided two of its contributions were worthy of fame on the Smash Bros. Roster.
Don't let a single one get away!
And the parent company of
That blue hedgehog again, of all places.
is probably the prime example of this, with series like Panzer Dragoon, House of the Dead, and Fantasy Zone.
You're not even good enough to be
I'll
my
make you eat those words!
But what about the United States? Well, Steve Russell, an American, presents a fair case that his shooting game is the first game. As in, first video game ever. On a mainframe computer, Space War was distributed and played on other machines, not just for show. Well, it's a shooter, all right. Look at its clear influence on others in the genre. It would also go on to influence the first ever arcade machines sold to the public 10 years later, in 1971, by the company that would dominate American games in the era. So it was clearly an important genre here for some time.
Part of the fascination is the way the games are designed. Take 13-year-old Paul Glatzer playing Zaxxon. The game is three-dimensional. The screen is full of tricks to avoid. Your airplane moves faster than the speed of sound. Your tongue hungers for a kill.
I like the details on it. There's good details on the games.
There was synergy between the regions, too. After all, imported machines from Japan were really successful in the States.
I could have done that for longer. Just I lost all my ships.
And a home version of Space Invaders was the killer app of the Atari 2600. Japan even started building off subgenres that American developers originated. So why is it that there's just this mysterious blind spot in history, and then when we come back, it's this? Why did the two diverge so much? The same year the Western market got Doom, the Eastern market got Batsugun. The same year the West got Half-Life, the East got Esperade. The same year the West got Halo, the East got Ikaruga. The Great Schism. When the American industry weakened in the early 1980s, the arcade shooter vanished with it, and the genre never came back. No, when PCs renewed Western dominance, they returned with something new, incorporating the arcade mechanics into an adventure, creating the first-person shooter. And since then, it's always been this sort of division. You know, you could probably count on one hand the number of Japanese-developed first-person shooters, and well, could you even imagine any of the big Western developers making something like this? Unlikely. Fans in the West have put up with untold hurdles to access their favorite games in the meantime. Shelling out for expensive arcade boards, managing with untranslated works, or struggling through inferior console ports. However, higher access to games in the modern landscape, coupled with passionate independent developers, is leading to an enormous resurgence in popularity for the first time in decades. So, what did we miss in the meantime? The swaths of history locked behind arcade machines or exclusivity to Japan. Well, we missed a lot. This isn't just a story of East versus West. It's also a story of the early internet.
And now a story that'll make no sense whatsoever. Is it zero zilt? There's a new phrase creeping into our language from the internet, and it goes like this.
All your days are belong to us.
It's a story of early esports. It's a story of digital copyright laws. And we'll get to all of that in due time. After all, this is a really long story, covering more than 700 games and dozens of companies over 50 years. For now, it'll be easier if we can start a bit smaller, summarizing each of the 9 shooting subgenres. You're watching the Belmont Index. Carnival shooting galleries, a staple of arcade entertainment for over 100 years, are the precursor to the shooting genre. The link between them and arcade video games as we know today traces back to the inclusion of electronic components in mechanical games. Our early key players imported some of these machines from America and created their own to build empires in Japan. Sega, Taito, and Namco were already primed to dominate the evolution in entertainment that followed. Pong was commercially viable to import, so they quickly got to work selling modified versions of it. Taito had an ace up their sleeve, though, ready to deconstruct and understand how to make original video games, a first for Japan. As Tomohiro Nishikado's skill set deepened, the tornado approached ever closer. In 1978, Space Invaders launched and changed the world forever. The craze that followed was really unprecedented, and it fostered a much more mature environment than we saw before. Developers took that base concept of Space Invaders and iterated with their own unique spins. That's why our story begins with Space Invaders, progenitor of the first true shooting subgenre, the fixed shooter. Fixed shooters are straightforward. The player moves along a single axis while firing and dodging projectiles. Defeat each wave of enemies to get the highest score possible. Everyone got in on the action. Sega, Irem, Konami, Coca-Cola? Some took new ideas a little further, like Polaris and Hellfire adding more freedom to player movement. Radar Scope and Juno First did a little isometric thing. And Nintendo rounds out the weirdness while shooting Donkey Kong with bug spray. Our next subgenre harkens back to some of those early milestones we talked about before. Space War and computer space. Even though they were a bit too early to find mainstream success, Consumers were definitely ready for Atari's next big step in 1979. Asteroids launched onto the scene with lessons learned from what made Space Invaders tick, including addictive high score chasing and screen clearing action. So begins the tale of our next subgenre, the area shooter. While the end goal is similar, there's much freer range of movement. The player can often shoot or move in any direction, and the playing area itself is no longer locked to one frame. A smaller variant also branched off with the release of Defender in 1981. While still defeating waves of enemies in an area, the screen is now limited horizontally. Atari didn't quite have the same staying power with their next attempt at innovation. In 1981, they launched Tempest, kicking off the last of our, let's call them primitive subgenres. Here's to tube shooters. Take a fixed shooter, wrap the axis in a circle to simulate a 3D effect, like you're looking down into a tube, and there you go. Pretty cool if you have one of those arcade cocktail tables, but it didn't catch on a whole lot. Jeff Minter of Llamasoft injected some psychedelic flair in the subgenre. Let's just say tube shooters largely shared a resting place with Atari itself. On the Jaguar. Alright, that wraps up our first 3 subgenres. And as simple as they may seem, I'd caution against taking them for granted. You know, this was at a time where nearly everything was a milestone, right? So because of entries in these genres, we got our first game in color. We got our first game soundtrack. So many staples that are like foundational to the industry, right? And even though they have sort of remained as relics of the past, except for that one time where you get to shoot a giant trash can in front of the Twin Towers, it'll be super clear to see how they set the foundation for our games to come. For example, also in 1981, we get the meaty zinger of Scramble. Does it look familiar? Developed by Konami, Scramble took some of the framework of Defender. However, it swapped enemy waves and free movement for set patterns and a scrolling level with a clearly defined start and end. It might not look like much, but we have our next big trendsetter, folks. We're not going to fully dive in quite yet, because it'd be really easy to get lost on this chain. So for now, let's just stick to the concept of an auto-scrolling level. Others would dip their toes in, like Sega's isometric Zaxxon. Quite the success, but clunky. Hard to replicate or expand on. But tilt that perspective just a bit more and yes, perfection. With Namco's Xevious in 1982, we now had an unstoppable pair. We got vertical. We got horizontal. Everyone wants in. But let's pause here. There's something special about these two that transcends the evils of the video game industry. To understand what that is, we need to return to prehistory to catch up on our remaining subgenres. Our next batch starts with one that took a while to standardize. In part, that's because early entries didn't look that different from area shooters, but also because the controls were really tricky to nail down. Not every cabinet is going to have tank levers, or a literal dial to aim player fire. When the subgenre finally did come to its own, the East and West took different approaches. Let's chat about the top-down shooter. We'll start with the branch from America. These games often string together rooms like a dungeon, each with its own wave of enemies. Rather than buttons, players often have two joysticks to independently control movement and fire. The Japanese variant is more closely aligned with scrolling levels, with a start and finish. It moves at your pace though, and shots are simply fired in the direction the player is facing. Think of Commando, Ikari Warriors, the one where you play as Cuban revolutionary Che Guevara. Oh, and Pocky and Rocky. What else can we do with shooters? Oh shit. You know what's cool? Donkey Kong! Platformers! Wait, what if we just add physics to our guns? Once again, this genre took a bit to get going, considering how slow platforming was at the time. Early entries seem like a big step away from the high-octane direction its cousins went. That would change, though, once Konami had something to say about it. They're coming in hot with Contra and the platforming shooter. We're now met with the first real challenge to indexing genres. There are plenty of games that have you platforming and defeating enemies that simply don't fit here. So let's briefly refresh some index definitions. Genres categorize the fundamental purpose of a game, and subgenres categorize its implementation. So, platforming shooters should still prioritize firing and dodging projectiles by using platforming mechanics, like gravity and pits to fall into, as extra spice. You might have heard the term run and gun passed around for this type of game, but we're all about consistent conventions here, goddammit, and that phrase has been used since Reagan was president. Besides, you're also running and gunning in top-down shooters, and those are different. You're running and gunning in Mega Man, but that's really different, and focuses more on tricky platforming while having weapons. The versatility of action platformers has reduced how often we get pure platforming shooters, but hey, look at Cuphead! Okay, look, it's time I be a man and apologize. Earlier, I really glossed over the electromechanical games of the 1960s, and to all my EM heads out there, I'm sorry. Please let me rectify this right now. For my money, the single biggest development to our story before Space Invaders was this right here. A big, hefty, honkin' machine called Periscope.
A machine game called Periscope. A nice, harmless way of getting your own back on the Navy, perhaps.
A lot of the details are lost to history. Namco and Sega made similar machines around the same time, so it may have been licensed? Listen, the 60s were crazy. We had important things to keep track of. The bottom line is, Sega's model was slim, and they had a huge distribution network. Not only would their Periscope set the everlasting arcade standard of a quarter per play, it would become a transformational success that revitalizes a stagnant entertainment industry in America. Fast forward to the early 80s again, and Sega tries on some of Zaxxon's pseudo 3D technology to turn Periscope into a real video game. Sub-Rock 3D. It's finally time for gallery shooters. We have a very simple concept here. You point and shoot.
I don't want to die!
My God.
More often than not, they'd use tried and true technology from the 1930s. Light guns, with sensors on both the target and physical controller, indicate whether an aim was accurate. Nintendo has an extensive history of light gun games for home use, but we also saw them in Sega's gun corners, and later, attached directly to arcade cabinets everywhere. Despite having a storied legacy, the control scheme really did kind of lock gallery shooters in a corner. Of course, arcades eventually became a relic, and home consumers weren't really into buying new plastic with every console, especially when it only supported a few games. Now, the concept is simple and classic enough to never truly disappear. It's prolific in mini-games, and there's always a brief resurgence each time console technology matches up. Like VR headsets, or Wii Remote sensors.
Looking at my keys, stranger? You wouldn't be trying to get the sheriff out of jail now, would you? Charco! Huh? Show him what we do to trouble.
Looks like this good old boy's seen his last gunfight. Time to take him to Boot Hill.
Now, we've had little tastes in this genre of immersive 3D, but one group of games dove headfirst. Sega's at it again with, Buck Roger? And hey, games on Laserdisc. That's cool. A couple misses, but listen, we're all a work in progress, right? 1985 rolls around and Yu Suzuki gives us Space Harrier to really kick off the rail shooter. progression of technology is perhaps more evident in this subgenre than any other. It starts with Sega's sprite scaling hits, which simulate 3D by smoothly zooming 2D images in and out. British developer Argonaut Games hit back by developing Star Fox in 1993 for Nintendo. Unfortunately, a two-way race between Sega's Panzer Dragoon series and the Star Fox games was most of the subgenre. Responsive controls seemed difficult for other developers to nail down, leading to a lot of mediocrity. It's unfortunate because of all the subgenres here, rail shooters are closest to towing the line between arcade-based and more modern design. Perhaps in another world, they'd still be thriving. But a subgenre whose fate was tied so closely to just a few franchises makes it really tricky to weather the storm of experimental mistakes. So, where does that leave the shooting genre today?
Stage 1.
We saw many of our primitive genres hit their growth ceiling and wind down, and others faded into obscurity. The thing is, they still exist everywhere, whether as mini-games or by folding in trending modifiers, like roguelite elements. This genre is truly so baked into the industry that nearly every action game will have shooting DNA somewhere. So it's certainly rare to find a pure tube shooter on the market these days. And here's what sets our remaining two subgenres apart. A wildly dedicated fan community that fuels its own success outside of the gaming mainstream. Let's head back one more time to where we left off with Scramble and Xevious to understand why shoot-em-ups, or shmups, still see entries to this day. Konami continued refining the formula Scramble set until it hit the jackpot in 1985 with Gradius. Carefully navigating an auto-scrolling level while taking out enemies for a stronger ship, these are the hallmarks of the horizontal shoot-em-up, or H-shmup. The Gradius series was an empire of its own, with sequels, spin-offs, and parodies of itself. Irem's R-Type and Taito's Behemoth, the multi-screen Darius, would emerge in 1987 as the two primary challengers to the throne. Though the similarities are evident, each of the three provide a distinct flavor we can see through their power-up systems. In Gradius, players are rewarded with collectibles that fill a new space in a bar at the bottom of the screen. Players are given the choice which power-up to activate, whether they would be willing to sacrifice a faster ship until they collect another to get the double shot. R-Type's hallmark is an auxiliary device that can protect or attack at will, further opening the options to approach each scenario. Darius has pickups for specific aspects of your ship, or a wild mechanic of capturing enemies and using their type of firepower. A single game has so many ways to approach it, which provides a huge incentive to keep replaying until you discover what gets the highest score. This can sometimes make for more methodical and thoughtful gameplay as the player weaves through routes, avoiding bullets from every direction. Don't assume, though, that just because its vertical counterpart is flipped on its side, that it's the same type of game. In some ways, it's even a nearly opposite approach. Xevia surely set a strong example for other games to build off, but in my opinion, it took a couple years for its progeny to find their stride. Tiger Heli, released by Toa Plan in 1985, included a screen-clearing bomb as a panic button, giving some cushion to amp up the difficulty. Xanac, released by Compile in 1986, allowed players in a tiny ship to move at blazing speeds, collecting power-ups that automatically changed your weapon type. Sort of the anti-Gradius. We're ending with a bang, and it only goes up from here. Let's talk about the vertical shoot 'em up, or V-Shmup. Raw, reactive difficulty. That's what most associate with the subgenre, and it's not entirely wrong. As hardcore players improved and needed more of a challenge to match, developers had to meet them there. Hudson Soft's traveling game caravans, where players could try out their latest releases in person, even featured shmups with caravan modes, short bursts where competitors tried to beat each other's high scores. Although Hudson's shmups released for home consoles rather than the arcades, that was hardly the norm. Same with Compile's follow-ups to Xanac, the Aleste series, which found its footing on home computers. No, V-Shmups largely remained a subgenre built in arcades for a 3x4 aspect ratio. Our big-name developers put in quite the effort, but profitability waned in the mid to late 80s. In the arcades, we saw a bigger bump for brawling and fighting games, so developers like Capcom and Konami slowly shifted their priorities. Here's where something really interesting happens. Those smaller developers, the shmup specialists, they take the reins of the genre. Toa Plan remained the master of their craft with new releases yearly. Ships got even faster, bullets became more numerous. That wasn't enough to keep these companies afloat financially, though. Toa Plan went bankrupt, Compile cut out its shmup development, but when pushed to the fringe of the industry, staff formed new companies like Rising and Cave in the early 90s. And sure, access to fewer global resources might have limited their scope, but remember how iterative the genre was. If practice makes perfect, every single aspect of these mechanics were refined to a T as it became clear what clicked. Like complex scoring systems that push the player to not just survive, but chain hits in short windows. Or mechanics to incentivize risky up-close shots. They're more than just gimmicks. They're dialects to a language. And sure, access to fewer global resources might have also limited their reach, but remember how tight the fan base was. Hobbyist developers emerged, breathing even more life into these now underground games. And my lord, did they really push the genre to new limits. As it turns out, when profit is no longer a concern, art can truly emerge. Well, folks, that should wrap it up for the day. For the most part, at least. There are some outlier groups that we didn't really cover, like platforming shooters that auto-scroll, some fixed shooters that kind of blend with gallery shooters a little bit, and one of my favorites, there's this minigame compilation WarioWare type arcade game that combines all of these subgenres, which is pretty cool. Keep in mind, this was a summary, a really, really abbreviated one. We didn't necessarily have time to talk about how the American occupation of Japan post-World War II influenced the genre. Didn't have time to talk about why the founder of Sega stood like this. So, we'll get there. We started this way to make everything that's coming a little bit more digestible. Here's the plan. 5 videos with 5 stories each. It's a series that'll cover different eras of shooting game history, featuring interwoven tales of the developers and their craft. Corporate drama, little ships that go... and... That being said, the Belmont Index is not supposed to be just about this genre. It's kind of a special case, I think. Maybe because it's the first one, or maybe because it's sort of uniquely esoteric and misunderstood. And I'm in far too deep at this point. So it's getting this little special series. We'll still be indexing other genres in the meantime with these smaller summaries. Either way, thanks for watching. I hope you'll hit subscribe and join for the next video.